Unit 2, Social Reform in America. By the late 18th century, Americans had fought for their political independence and had won it. They had created a government for a new nation and had witnessed the rise of political factions and established political parties. Now with this political system in place, and as they were headed into the 19th century, Americans began to focus on expanding the parameters of American democracy. They lobbied to increase the vote to more citizens and to improve American society. This led to a series of reform movements that existed primarily between 1810 and 1850. It is the first of many social reform movements we'll discuss in this class. In the 19th century, these social reform movements included temperance, education, mental health, slavery, and women's rights. While they emphasized different aspects of American life that needed to be reformed, they shared commonalities. All desired to make America a more democratic, better, and fairer place. All included middle-class membership. By the 19th century, as a consequence of industrialization, the middle class was a rising and growing class, particularly in the Northeast. They included the participation of women. Although primarily middle-class women engaged in social reform, so too did working-class women. And all were based in the northeastern part of the United States. The first and the earliest of the social reform movements was temperance. In the 1810 census, it was reported that nearly 4,000 distilleries of hard alcohol existed in the United States. While the United States possessed territory west of the Mississippi, the states of the United States, seen in the pink here, existed east of the Mississippi and were far numerous than the states of the United States today. In this territory, nearly 25 million gallons of hard alcohol were being produced and consumed. The beverage of choice was whiskey, whereas in the 18th century, rum had been the alcohol most consumed. The question, therefore, is who drank? And when and why did they drink? Today, women drink. It's acceptable socially for them to do so. However, in the 19th century, that was not the case. While women did drink, middle and upper class women did not to a great extent at least. This had to do with 19th century Victorian ideals about femininity and masculinity that we'll discuss later on in this lecture. So primarily, men consumed the alcohol. So why did they do it? They do it for many of the same reasons we do today. Poverty drove drinking. Many of the working class men in low-wage, dead-end jobs drank after work to drown their sorrows. In the 1830s and 40s, the United States also witnessed the arrival in great numbers of the Germans and the Irish, who brought their cultural traditions with them to northeastern cities like Boston and New York, and who spread their culture westward as they migrated to places in the Ohio Valley and as far west as Missouri. Taste had a lot to do with the consumption of alcohol. It wasn't uncommon to drink alcohol with meals. Like today, celebrations and holidays were marked by a toast or a bottle of alcohol. They toasted the birth of a child and celebrated the completion of a barn raising, or the beginning or the end of a new year. Depression, as it does today, also led to alcohol consumption and abuse. In order to escape one's misery of daily life, people drank. Addiction also was a result of alcohol consumption, the need to consume alcohol. While these factors are present today, part of the motivation of drinking in the 21st century, medicinal reasons are often not why we drink. Today we have medicines to cure our ailments, but in the 19th century, with a lack of pills and therapy, often people use alcohol to drown their sorrows, to numb their pain. Medicine was not available, so consequently they used alcohol, perhaps to numb an amputation or to sweat out a fever. However, Large-scale consumption and production of alcohol gave rise to fear. Many people began to see the overconsumption of alcohol as not just an individual problem, but a social problem that needed to be combated. Problems that stem from overabuse and use of alcohol were poverty. Many of the working class men, once paid, went to the taverns and spent their money drinking. This led to impoverishment of the working class. These same men who used and abused alcohol would return to their homes and enact violence on their wife and their children. Addiction also resulted from the overuse and abuse of alcohol and the need to drink that oftentimes led to death. Many families found themselves without a father or a husband who could provide for them as a consequence of the use and abuse of alcohol. Many of these same individuals had previously been absent from their work sites as a consequence of a hangover or drunken state. They failed to show up for work. Accidents on the job were also fairly common in the 19th century. Having hangovers or still drunk, employees would come to work, and with the unregulated factories found themselves victims of accidents as a consequence of operating technology and machines. As a consequence, groups arose, particularly in the Northeast, that tried to combat the social ills that they believed resulted from drinking. Three groups in particular formed the core of the temperance movements. These were working class women, middle class women, and employers. Working class women found themselves the victim of violence and economic hardship, and consequently supported temperance as a result. While some middle class women found themselves victim of violence, many joined for moral and religious reasons. They believed it was their moral and Christian duty to go out into society and to help those in need. Oftentimes, temperance provided these middle-class women with a social outlet. Employers also joined temperance movements, but primarily for economic reasons. They needed employees who could come to work ready to work. They needed productivity, and consequently, they joined the temperance movements. The temperance movements were many. The most famous was the Women Christian Temperance Union, but there was also the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance. By the 1830s, some 5,000 temperance movements were scattered throughout the Northeast in states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and Pennsylvania. These were primarily the industrial states in the Northeast. While unified in their goal to curtail drinking, their proposals varied. The more extreme groups lobbied for the complete abstinence of alcohol. They wanted to prohibit the production, the sales, and the consumption of alcohol. In such way, they believed that the problems resulting from alcohol use and abuse could eventually be curtailed, if not completely eliminated. This kind of activism and thinking will lead to the Prohibition movement of the 20th century, and culminate in 1920 in the enforcement after the passage of the 18th Amendment. This is a subject we'll return to in later lectures. At the local level in the 19th century, John and Annie Bidwell joined the Prohibition movement. It provides us a local angle with the subject, as both were significant figures in the history of Chico. Others promoted medicinal use. They believed it was still necessary to use alcohol to alleviate pain and for their medical ailments. Other moderates proposed limited drinking, that during the week and perhaps after work drinking would be acceptable, but not on Sundays. Sundays should be reserved for families and for church. These proposals are often referred to as blue laws. We still have such laws on the books. They vary, however. For example, in California, one cannot be publicly served nor sold alcohol between the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Proposals then were local, as they are today, and statewide. They varied. but were primarily centered in the Northeast. Later on, when we talk about prohibition, we'll see that was a federal program that affected drinking on a national level. The activism of the temperance and the results varied. However, overall, we see the widespread and precipitous decline of the production and the consumption of alcohol. Those results are evident in the chart in front of you. You can see that by the 1830s and 40s, alcohol consumption precipitously dropped. We would never drink as much as we had in the 19th century. However, by the end of the late 19th century and continuing into the early 20th century, alcohol consumption was once again on the rise. This has to do with the fact that industrialization, urbanization, and immigration led to wide-scale problems that increased drinking. This ultimately culminated in the 18th Amendment's passage and enforcement through 1933. Eventually, prohibition will be eliminated in 1933. In 1933, with the 21st Amendment. We will return to this subject matter later on in this course. At the same time as temperance, we see the drive for educational reform. This was spearheaded by Horace Mann. But before the 1840s and before Horace Mann, education was something done in the home by the parents. It was part of the father's duty to educate his children. This education was both secular and religious. It consisted of subject matter such as reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also of prayer and biblical lessons. This was the average American. The elite Americans in society hired tutors to come into their homes and to educate their sons and daughters. Boys, sons of the elite, oftentimes for higher education, were sent to private institutions such as Yale and Harvard. This occurred primarily in the Northeast, where education had and continued to be more greatly valued. However, in the South, literacy and education were low and less formal. This had to do with the emphasis of agriculture and slavery. Farmers saw education as something pragmatic and not formal in nature. They believed that their sons and daughters less needed how to read and write, and more so needed to learn how to farm the fields and milk a cow, or how to sew. Plantation owners restricted education for their slaves in slave codes that we'll later talk about. Consequently, literacy was very low in the South. This had long-term effects and continued into the 20th century. Eventually, however, with the rise of industrialization in the Northeast, men increasingly worked outside of their homes and no longer had the time to educate their children. This was left to women. As a consequence of the American Revolution, the rise of the American political system, and industrialization, individuals like Thomas Jefferson began to propose a basic public school system where both boys and girls would attend for a short period of time. Boys would need an education to become providers and participants in the American political system. Girls would need a base education because they would become wives and mothers who would educate their children at home. This 18th century drive was unsuccessful, and Thomas Jefferson's proposal was not implemented. It would take several decades for Americans to start to desire to support and create a public education system in the United States. It was Horace Mann in the 1840s who spearheaded this drive for public educational reform. Horace Mann was the secretary of the Board of Education in Massachusetts. In 1846, he wrote his 10th annual report, his most famous of 12 reports that he wrote as the secretary of the Board of Education. In it, he proposed a tax-based public education system for Massachusetts. He believed that the benefits of education outweighed the negative. He asserted that education should be a basic right that all individuals should have access to guarantee them the life, liberty, and happiness guaranteed or promoted in the Declaration of Independence. He went so far as to say that denying children of an education was analogous to committing an act of infanticide. In other words, why have children if you're not going to care for them? It's as if you had killed them when they're in their infancy. While extreme, it is a powerful argument. He also argued that education was necessary to create better and more involved citizens. I believe this argument is still a very valid one. We today oftentimes see education exclusively as a means to an end, a way of getting a better and higher paying job. And that is indeed true. However, we should also think like Horace Mann and like Thomas Jefferson. How can we sustain democracy if we do not understand the issues that are being put forth and debated? For that we need an education, not just in reading and writing, but in the American political system. We need to understand how it works and how it functions so we can improve it and maintain it if we need to. So education is a means of preserving democracy, not just in the 19th century or 20th century, but in 21st century today. Horace Mann also argued that there will be economic and possibly social cost if we do not support public education. In other words, if we don't spend our money supporting schools and educating Americans, we'll have to spend it somewhere else as a consequence of crime and poverty. Money will have to be spent for building jails and prisons and being poured forth in almshouses if we don't have people who can be self-sufficient. His argument is a powerful one, his evidence convincing. However, there are many Americans who continue to oppose Horace Mann. In his report, he must consider the arguments of his opponents, and does. Many of the people who resisted tax-based public education did so on the basis of personal interest and immediate interest. For example, they thought that being taxed for the creation and support of public schools oftentimes was unfair. If they did not have kids, they asked why should they pay for something that they did not use. Those who had already educated their children at their private expense asked why they should pay for something as well that they didn't use. And there were those who were paying for the education of their children through tutors and private schools who promoted the notion that it was a double tax. They were paying for something that they did not use. These arguments are cogent, and you can see that they still exist in America today. Many of the opponents of Mann's 10th report disliked the curriculum. They believed that they had more control over what was being taught if they taught it in the home or in private schools. Many also disliked who was in the classroom. The most democratic institution that we have in the United States today is the public school system. Everybody can and usually does go to public school, regardless of their socioeconomic background, their ethnicity, and their class. Many Americans did not like who was in those schools in the 19th century, primarily because of the arrival of the Irish Catholic, especially in the Northeast. Protestant Americans did not want their children mixing with the less educated Irish Catholics in the classroom. Consequently, Horace Mann faced great opposition to the implementation of the public schools. Nonetheless, eventually reforms did occur, slowly and throughout the 19th century, and not uniformly. They began locally, and they began in Massachusetts, and from there they spread throughout the Northeast and eventually America. Some of these reforms include the following: the feminization of education. Initially, it was single men who educated in schools. They wanted to become lawyers and doctors and needed a means of support. So oftentimes, as a result, they spent their time educating children. However, they lacked some of the skills that they needed in order to educate properly and formally these children. Increasingly, young single women became the educators at the primary level. It offered women a career opportunity prior to being married that would pay them well and give them relatively high social status. Think of your elementary education. Most of us were educated by women. That goes back to the 19th century, to some of these reforms. With more women entering the teaching profession, we see the professionalization of teaching and the creation of normal schools. Chico State was one such school. These were schools where young women were educated to become teachers. No longer could one just read and write in order to teach. One had to learn how to teach. As a consequence, we do see the professionalization of education. By the end of the 19th century, we see the secularization of education. As more immigrants arrived in the United States with diversity of religion and background, and less time of students in the public schools to learn the subject matter was secularized. They took religion out of the school and left it to the parents and to the church. Reading, writing, arithmetic, and eventually Americanization were the foci of the public school system. By the beginning of the early 20th century, there was a movement to standardize education. In other words, to have grades, grade levels, and a uniform subject matter being taught at each grade. We do not see compulsory education enforced until after World War II. Most Americans still needed their children in the fields and in the factories to supplement their income and could not afford to have their children in school year-round or at all. Only with the increasing rise of prosperity because of and after World War II do more Americans have the means by which to allow their kids to go to school. Education will become compulsory, in other words, required, at least K through 12 in the United States. We will return to educational reform later in this class. The third area of reform involved mental health. I want you to think about how we perceive mental health and mental illness today and how we treat those who are afflicted. What avenues do we have to assist those in need? To understand Dick's contribution to mental health reform, we need to understand how Americans in the 19th century viewed mental health problems and physical afflictions. They differed somewhat from how we look at it today. Many believed that mental illness and physical disability was a product of sin, one's own sin that had brought about such affliction, or the sins of the parents who had brought on these afflictions. This stemmed from their more traditional religious beliefs. In a less scientific age, many people also believed that the cycles of the moon, the lunar cycles, affected behavior. Consequently, when someone acted out in a violent fashion, they referred to it as a product of lunacy. Demon possession was also an excuse given to explain abnormal behavior, such as seizures, for example, or hallucinations. As a consequence, many believed that little could be done to help those afflicted, that it was nature and not nurture that was the solution to the problem, and that little could be done to change nature. Consequently, it explains the actions that they took in regards to those who were afflicted with such ailments. Many who they believed would not be productive citizens. Their children and their friends oftentimes were put into almshouses where they could be taken care of. These are poor houses where they could be provided with a bed and a hot meal. Oftentimes, those who were afflicted by mental health problems found themselves imprisoned in local jails or even eventually prisons. This is a place where they believed they could be watched and monitored. However, none of them had been convicted of a crime, and yet their rights were being violated as they were held in facilities that were horrific in nature. The conditions of the asylums, the poorhouses, the jails are the subject of Dorothea Lynn Dix's reading, Mental Health in America, Concerns for the Mentally Ill. You'll be reading this and doing a related quiz. As you read and do the quiz, you should consider the following. Who was Dix? In the introduction, it describes who she was. In many respects for the 19th century, she was an unlikely reformer. What she saw motivated her into activism, and she was capable of creating significant reform in the American health system. We are indebted to her efforts. The fourth area of social reform involves slavery. In the 19th century, specifically in the American South, there were supporters of slavery. This in part had to do with their agricultural system and the lack of the technology to harvest the crops, specifically cotton. By the 19th century, cotton was a cash crop upon which the South increasingly relied. In order to defend slavery, many people argued it was their right to possess slaves, as slaves were their property, which they had purchased at the slave auctions. The slave codes that had been passed in the South reduced a slave to a piece of property and stripped them of their humanity. They were legally defined as a piece of property that could be bought and sold. So many Southerners defended slavery on that right. No one had the right to strip their property from them. Many Southerners also believed that the issue of slavery belonged to the state and the local government, and that no federal government shouldn't get involved in discerning the issue of slavery in the American South. They asserted that state governments should be the one to regulate, if at all, slavery, and that individuals possessed rights to property, and that no government should strip them of those property rights. They also defended slavery on cultural grounds. Racial prejudices and stereotypes led to very discriminatory beliefs about African American slaves. Consequently, they justified slavery in racial terms. Many also believed that slavery helped those who had previously come from Africa in a more primeval state, that they were being elevated in the United States as slaves. While flawed, these are the arguments that the South used. But in the Northeast, a growing anti-slavery movement was emerging, but it was also divided. Not all Northerners supported slavery. That's sort of a misconception that we have. And those who did want to end it were themselves divided amongst gradualists and abolitionists. Both wanted to end slavery, but the terms upon which slavery should end and when slavery should end is what they disagreed on. Gradualists promoted the gradual containment of slavery to a specific region where it could eventually be eliminated. They recognized, for example, how many Southerners, especially the plantation elite, had become dependent upon slavery for labor. They recognized that the immediate abolition of slavery could be economically problematic as well as culturally difficult for Southerners. So while they did not like slavery, they promoted gradual containment of it and elimination of it. They were countered by the abolitionists, who also believed in the end of slavery, but that slavery was not going away nor being contained, but actually growing in the United States in the 19th century. This indeed was true. Because of the rise of cotton and the profitability of cotton, more slaves were needed to pick that cotton so that it could be processed into textiles in the northeastern factories. Slavery was growing westward of the Mississippi and had gone as far as Texas and Missouri, and the numbers of slavery were increasing. Even though the slave ban went into effect in 1808, which effectively said no more slaves can be imported from Africa, the number of slaves in the 19th century increased to 4 million on the verge of the Civil War. This has to do with forced breeding and oftentimes rapes. Even the abolitionists themselves were divided. This had to do with the degree of freedom. While gradualists and all abolitionists wanted the end of slavery, many disagreed upon the degrees of freedom that former slaves, once freed blacks, should have. They agreed that freedom was necessary, but oftentimes debated whether or not free blacks should be fully equal to free whites. The abolitionists grew in the 1830s and took hold of the anti-slave movement, primarily in the Northeast, and they continued to grow throughout the 1830s and the 40s. They comprised many individuals, who included William Lloyd Garrison, who was a publisher of a periodical known as The Liberator. Frederick Douglass, whom you see here, he was a former slave. Frederick Douglass knew slavery firsthand, and he went on a lecture circuit to inform Americans about the conditions of slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a woman who wrote the famous work Uncle Tom's Cabin, who also conveyed conditions of slavery in the United States. Theodore Weld, a writer, informing Americans about the various conditions of slavery. What these individuals did was promote the complete and immediate end of slavery. They tried to educate Americans about the atrocities of slavery and the need to abolish it immediately and completely. While a movement, they took their actions further and in 1844 formed the Freedom Party, a political party designed with the intent of ending slavery. If the current parties in government would not, they would elect members who would. Their sole plank in their platform was to end slavery. Consequently, membership was fairly limited. Many Northern Republicans did not necessarily support the complete and immediate freedom of slaves, nor the equality of newly freed blacks. So the Freedom Party's success was limited. It did, however, funnel into a new political party that would be established in 1854, the Republican Party. The Republican Party was staffed by and supported by abolitionists, but not exclusively. And as a consequence, the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, would be associated with ending slavery. I would like you to look at the readings and the quiz to understand better the conditions of slavery in America. The abolitionists were fairly successful in bringing to Americans who had never seen a slave in the Northeast the conditions of slavery. In other words, out of sight, out of mind, it was easy to ignore the fact that slavery did exist in America. But through the lectures and the books and the publications of the abolitionists, increasingly it was very difficult for middle-class Americans in particular to ignore that slavery existed, and they would have to be the ones to do something about it. In the case of the South, the abolitionist movement made Southerners more defensive of slavery. They defended it using the reasons that I'd previously discussed, and they became less willing to end slavery. These are debates and arguments that will eventually help produce the conditions that produce the Civil War.